Hello, hello, and welcome to episode 14 of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That's Kevin.
Today, we're about translating and localization, the differences between the two, good and bad.
This is a timely podcast, right? News has break. It's a little bit over a week old now, this news. But in the Trails community, there was a group called Zerofield that published unofficial fan translations of Trails games that hadn't come out yet. They started doing this with Cold Steel 3. It existed for 4, Hajimari, Kuro no Kiseki. And the way that these spreadsheets worked is that there would be an overlay on your PC, and then you would find a way to stream from your console onto the PC through like a capture card or through remote play, and you would control the spreadsheet and the game in tandem so that you're essentially giving the game English subtitles. And it was one of the best ways, if not the best way or the only way, for Western fans to stay up to date with the series. However, they have been taken down by NIS of America. And the most likely reason is that there's been efforts to make injection patches into the PC ports of these games. We've talked about this on the podcast. I'm currently playing Kuro no Kiseki through that method. I don't think that we could deny the fact that having an unofficial translation injected into the game is a direct threat to NISA's prospects, or at the very least, they can foresee it as competition for something that they own the rights to.
Why doesn't NISA just give the English versions of the games faster?
You know, I don't know. And I'm really mad about that because, okay, we as a community have had to rely on fan translations for the Crossbell games for years. NISA did a good thing. They recognized the hard work of the Geofront community, bought the translations. They're bringing it to the States. And I understand that there is port work that they have to do to get the base PS4 version. First of all, inject the English text into that because it's a slightly different version than the one that had been translated before. So there's more things they have to do. And then they also have to port all of that stuff to the Switch and to PC. However, the cumulative effect of how fucking long that they are taking to release these old games mean that we're not getting Hajimari no Kiseki until 2023. Kuro no Kiseki hasn't even been announced yet for NISA to translate. And Kuro no Kiseki 2 is coming out in Japan at the end of the month. Look, there's a real demand for fans to be able to keep up to date with the series, and NISA is not fulfilling those demands. And without knowing their corporate structure and seeing to the weeds, I don't know how plausible it is for them to speed things up. But I think we need to recognize that frustration exists.
Kuro 2, I think it's Crimson Sin, comes out end of September in Japan. Yes?
Yes.
The first Crossbell game comes out in the West end of September. So we are 7 games behind.
I mean, I think literally they come out the same day. It's not quite 7 games behind because we do have all of Cold Steel, right? But it's causing a bit of a backlog. Plus, they're publishing this translation of a spin-off title called Nayuta no Kiseki, which is an Ys-style action RPG that may or may not have ties to the actual Trail series. But yeah, it means that we are very far behind, and I don't see any real efforts to expedite this process.
And it's a shame because Western fans don't have good options, Colin. They can wait. They cannot go on some of the community websites, the subreddit, Twitter, fora, what say you, because they don't want to be spoiled by the Japanese language of those who know Japanese or the other East Asian languages. But that means, should they not partake in the community for years on end? Like just on the Twitter account that you and I have, I've seen horrifying images, full body Mishi costume with Van. Who the fuck is Van? I have a vague idea.
You only know Mishi because you only know about Van because I've been sending you pictures of Van. But yes, on our Twitter feed, we follow some people in the community. We're trying to figure out our way there. And it's a lot of fan art, it's a lot of discussion, and a lot of these people are playing Kuro no Kiseki right now. And part of the reason why I started playing was because I was tired of having to dodge the spoilers. For somebody like you, in which some of these characters that we've been talking about for years, you still don't know yet. I mean, I can't imagine how you're not being spoiled every day.
I scroll through the images as fast as I can, but when I see a giant rat looking thing casting an art, I have to stop and go, what in general The fuck? But I want to make something clear. Like the issue is not with people playing Kuro 2, posting fan art, posting their theories. More power to all of you. The issue is with NISA. And are they in the right? Are they in the wrong? I'll give you something that I talked to a friend who does IP law. I asked him about this, and he talked about how active copyright or active trademark defense. If you do not show you have a consistent record of enforcing the copyright, the trademark that you own, that you have a right to, courts will take a very dim view of enforcing it in general. If they can find selective enforcement for various sizes of cases that they, the one owning the rights, have knowledge of, that so and so is, for example, doing an unauthorized translation or merchandise or whatever. And so legally, the council would tell them in-house or on retainer, you have to shut this down if you want to maintain possession.
Mhm.
That's the legalistic defense, not the moral defense of give us the fucking games faster.
Well, I mean, I think we're dealing with two separate issues. I don't blame NIS from the legal or business standpoint for doing what they're doing, because I
No.
do buy the argument that some people will not double dip, especially if they're primarily PC players. If you've already bought Hajimari or Kuro no Kiseki from Clouded Leopard, you've beaten it, you don't see you need to go back and replay it. Why would you then buy the official release? Now, some people will buy the official release on principle. I'm one of those people. But not everybody is like that. They're expensive. I mean, games are expensive, and we're living in a time of inflation's kind of going down a little bit, but it's still like everybody's feeling the pain with that. What I will say, though, is that while I understand where they're coming from a business perspective, what I'm disappointed by is the seeming ignoring or stepping over the problems that they are causing with this. We delayed recording this podcast because we wanted to see this NIS America showcase to see if they would say anything about Kuro no Kiseki. And I didn't watch the showcase, but I did see the announcements. And no, they didn't mention it at all whatsoever. We still have no idea. Now, it is likely that they're going to announce a translation at some point, but technically we don't know.
I don't understand like why they can't say, don't worry, we'll get to Kuro. We'll get to Kuro 2. In as far as we have the ability to plan and whatever, we will get to the Trails games. We don't have definite release dates yet with our schedule and business processes, whatever.
Right. To me, the only reason why they can't do that is if they have contracts with Falcom on a game-by-game basis, and it's not a long-term NIS America localizes all of our games. And therefore, if it's by game basis, then they can't say that we're definitely going to get there, which is a problem for the fans, because if they don't do it, who else is going to do it? Xseed could also be doing it, but they haven't localized Trails in a long time.
And I've read that there was some bad blood with how the rights got transferred because, Colin, the Cold Steel games really marked the upswing in the West.
Yeah.
And what studio did that? What studio got the economic benefit? Was it Xseed or NISA?
I mean, the economic benefit was NISA, but the people who popularized it in the West and got it to the point where that could happen was Xseed. And by the way, Xseed is a much better localizer than NIS America.
And so I've read a number of places how there's some recriminations, some bitterness, how they did the work, but didn't get to reap a lot of the benefits.
Yeah.
Because if they had Cold Steel, or say the Crossbow games, Hajimari, Kuro, they'd be making a lot more money.
Absolutely. One thing that I do want to point out, though, is that, okay, they're taking down these translations, the Zerofield translations, in order to stop the patches. They cannot stop the patches that are already out. The Hajimari one is basically done insofar as it's going to be done, has been updated in a while. Kuro one is still being updated almost every day. They already have those. They're out there. And ironically, now these are the only ways to play the games, because you can't use the spreadsheets anymore because they keep trying to update on a server that doesn't exist anymore. So in a way, it's kind of like with digital distribution. Now, piracy is the only way to preserve these works of translation. It will affect us going forward, though. I mean, we cannot rely on the possibility that another group of Zerofield quality will step up to do a fan translation of Kuro 2. We can hope for it, but we don't know.
Colin, could you explain how the patches for Steam. What's the relationship to the overlay, to the spreadsheet?
There are two things that Zerofield produces: the translation and the overlay. What the patches do is they go and they take the translation that's present in the spreadsheet and inject it directly into the game. So instead of having to coordinate an overlay with the game, you're just playing the game. But it's the same text. It's the same translation. With Kuro, it's a little bit more extensive, where they're also trying to put in some machine translations for minor NPCs. But by and large, the most of the work is already done by Zerofield.
So, question: what do you think how likely this scenario I'm about to propose is? Zerofield goes on a private forum, website, Discord, Slack. I mean, not Slack, no one does Slack, and does a lot of the same work and then uploads patches, quasi anonymously throughout the internet, so you can't take them down because you don't know where or if the main work is being done and by whom. Could that happen?
It's possible, for sure. I will say that the guys who lead the team are going to have to think seriously about, do they want to put in all of this work for something that, if they get caught, is legally going to put them in trouble? Because they have a cease and desist letter, right? And if they're caught breaking that, then that opens them up for a huge amount of liability. And the problem with things like this is that the internet cannot keep secrets. The real idea, like if they actually are behind these putative new translations, we will know about it within a matter of weeks.
And I want to be clear, this is a free labor of love the Zerofield people have been doing. And whatever they decide is best for them is best for them.
Oh, absolutely. And plus, to top off all the unfairness from Zerofield's perspective, they didn't give permission to anybody to use their script for the patches.
I don't think Colin is all that upset this happened.
No, I mean, I'm glad that they made the patches. I am really upset about the consequences of it.
It's complex. The issue is really complex from a variety of angles and perspectives, because to play devil's advocate, I do see how NISA could think that if our sales drop below X amount because of this, it will not be sustainable to do more localizations. That said, with the scales involved, I do not think this is anywhere near the case. When you think of units sold in the West, we're talking almost telephone numbers here. It's 5-6 figures. And how many are using the patches? Do you have the knowledge and the desire? Hundreds? A couple thousand, maybe? I don't think it's a huge cost in actual terms.
No, I would agree with that. Before we wrap up our discussion of this news, I do want to talk about people's call to boycott NIS America. We see this a lot. I will never support them again for them doing this. And Kevin, what are your thoughts on it?
I get where they're coming from. The people, they've worked on it, or they know people who've worked on it, or they want to continue playing Kuro, or they want to play Kuro 2, whatever. I don't think it's smart, because without Zerofield, I think the most likely outcome long term is localizations come from NISA. Not unless we get another group of different people who have not gotten the cease and desist. I think the most likely outcome, NISA will be the sole provider. And so lock yourself out of this epic game series that you are so passionate about in the first place. I think once people have cooled their tempers, once the time goes by, we'll stop seeing this and we'll learn to live with the status quo.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Now, if you are dedicated enough to go and learn Japanese and you can play the original, God love you. You go and do that. You have no need to support NIS America. You do you, boo. For the rest of us who have not learned Japanese, NIS America is basically the only way to play these games if you remove the patches. And to top it all off, Falcom will use sales data for all of their releases in order to judge what's working, what's not working, what series are successful, what series aren't successful, and to decide who publishes their games and in what volume. The fact is, you boycotting NIS America for this reason does not appear on Falcom's spreadsheet as a not buying it out of protest. It appears as this didn't sell as much as we wanted it to. That's even assuming that boycott's going to work, and it's not.
Falcom has a spreadsheet? Don't they know Japanese?
Shut up, Kevin.
Speaking of sales data, I've read that a lot of the growth for the Trails games has been in the West over the past couple years.
I believe it.
It's declining in East Asia, but really on the upswing in the Western world. So the future of the Kaseki series looks to be, in some part, how do they sell in the West?
Right. Which, and now if we have an organized movement to not buy these games, I mean, look, I don't think it's going to work, first of all, because the amount of people who are on Twitter and therefore actually take that stuff seriously is small compared to the rest of the American consumer base of JRPGs. We've seen this time and time again. Pokemon comes out, people scream we need to boycott it. Pokemon Sword and Shield sell better than any Pokemon game ever has in the entirety of the franchise. So I also find getting wrapped up in this idea of never supporting NIS America again in order to teach them a lesson to be a bit silly, because it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. You are depriving yourself of supporting the official release and owning the game, being able to play the game legally for something that the company isn't even going to feel.
Is what NISA of America is doing, is that just a literal translation or is more stuff involved?
Here is where we transition. For the rest of the episode, what we want to do is talk about translation and localization in general. It's kind of been a hot topic lately. It's a perennial hot topic, but it's an important one. And Kevin and I come from academic backgrounds that we use other languages quite a bit. We have experience with translation. I've noticed that some people have some assumptions about what translation actually is that is not true. And so we wanted to break that down. But to answer your question, Kevin, there is a difference between translation and localization, whereas translation is you take the content of one text and you translate it into another language, and there are different ways of doing that, which we'll break down. Localization includes translation, but it also includes editing content in order to fit the cultural expectations of the target audience.
Okay, and so the knowledge you need for one or the other can be a lot different in some aspects. To translate a text ad literam, a literal or semi-literal sense, as you and I both know very well, Colin, you need a basic understanding of the grammar, vocab, a dictionary, and you can produce something usable that will get you a scraping pass on the language exams. But for localization, you need to know the culture of not just the receiving, but the importing community. You need to know the Japanese culture and American culture to understand cultural idioms, wordplay, what makes sense for the mores and customs in one versus the other. How do you get the sense across? You are giving the sense, pop culture and puns and media and movies and music, and what are the references to? What are the memes and whatever?
Yeah, so just to take an abstract example, wordplay is something that is very much dependent upon the language itself, right? It is difficult to be able to literally translate one instance of wordplay, say in Latin, and then translate that into English and maintain the playfulness of the words. On occasion, it can work, but most of the time, it cannot. So what a localization would do is find an equivalent wordplay in English that reflects the same idea as that found in the original text, even if it is a step different, even if it's not quite what the original text had.
But is it always faithful? Do localizations always do the intended? Are there any examples that we can think of localizations that almost censor the original media?
So I think that there's a distinction to be drawn between censoring local media but keeping the sense, or injecting so much different stuff into it that it becomes its own game. Fire Emblem Fates, for instance, has changed a support conversation that in Japanese basically sounds like, if I'm remembering this correctly, I could be wrong with the details, but it essentially sounds like somebody slipped a date rape drug and caused that character to then fall in love with the supporting character. That has been changed in the English release because it's creepy and a little bit rapey. And people were very mad that this was changed because people want the original experience. So that's an example of censorship. You see that a lot in minor changes, particularly in the visual department when we're playing JRPGs. If in the original Japanese, a lot of cleavage is shown, sometimes in the American release, only a little bit of cleavage is shown, or a cloud is put up to cover certain parts that were uncovered in the Japanese. Japanese. But an example of injecting a lot of your own stuff to kind of really make localization almost a separate product are working designs RPGs for the Sega CD and the PlayStation 1. So games like Lunar, for instance. I own Lunar. I haven't played it. It's on my list. But my understanding is that working designs, famously for a lot of the games that they localized in the States, vastly increased the difficulty, number one, and then also put in a lot of jokes that they thought would appeal to an American audience. And this is happening in the 90s, where gaming is seen as mostly a kid's thing. So there's a lot of fart jokes, for instance, that were not present in the original release. They are so extensive. A lot of these working design games have fan patches that keep the text of, like, keep the original English text, but take away a lot of the changes in order to have a non-working designs English version.
Localization, as we know far, far too well, it takes time. Like, simul-dub animes is very rare. So it just takes time to take something that makes it sound, in a lot of cases, like it could have been produced natively in the localized culture, with the wordplay, with the puns, with the dialogue. And I think, to me, that could be the gold standard of a localization. You can play it blind and almost think, or maybe do think, this was made in my culture.
I think for those of us who don't know Japanese, when we talk about localizations, when we talk about releases of the product in the States, that's really all that we can comment upon and evaluate the game based on. Because, like, I see a lot of people criticizing a game's translation when they really mean how it plays as an English product. Because in my view, if you're judging a translation, you have to be able to judge its accuracy and fidelity to the original text. And the only way to do that is to know the language of the original text.
I'll disagree slightly. There's some games, one in particular comes to mind, where they have the data mine. You can look at the Japanese, the literal translation of the Japanese, and the localization for any text in the game. Fire Emblem Three Houses. Treehouse is the studio, and you can see a lot of the significant, in a way, changes they made. Just to give a couple examples offhand, Byleth Edelgard's period ending refers to Edelgard and Byleth's relationship as spouses, and it's absent in the Treehouse localization. But if you look at the translation, literal of the Japanese, it's there. And more thematic, Constance, the unit Ashen Wolves, who is coded to have DID, dissociative identity disorder, in the Japanese. And in Three Hopes, which is a different localization studio, she refers to the other Constance as a separate personality in her body, in the sun, in the shadows. But in Three Houses, with Treehouse, she does not refer to herself in this manner, and that changes her character, how we perceive her character. And there's a lot of changes like that that are more substantial, more programmatic, and not the or the awkward translations of words or phrasings that you see for other games, like, say, Persona 5. There's a big, famous website for that. Sometimes also, what can seem awkward may be intentional. And Colin, you have an example you want to bring up?
I don't have an example of awkwardness being intentional. I do have an example of something that people have called a product of bad translation or a product of bad localization that is just a problem of bad copy editing. In Final Fantasy VII, in the beginning of the game, Aerith and Cloud are out on the slums, and you run into this guy who's sick. Give him a potion or something so he feels better. And the way that Aerith describes this man is, "This man are sick." And people have seen this as, well, this is what the Japanese says. It's not localized properly. And no, that's not true. From the limited knowledge I have of Japanese verbs, the verb des can mean either is or are, and it depends on the subject. That was just somebody writing an English sentence that doesn't make any fucking sense and didn't fix it.
Question. Is it possible that Aerith Gainsborough is just a fucking dumbass?
No, I'm sorry. She's not a fucking dumbass. I think that this copy editor was a fucking dumbass for missing something very, very basic. I don't want to disparage the hardworking people that make these, and they're under time constraints. You can't always do what doing this job quality wise demands of you. I'm just saying that if I'm translating a text and I produce a sentence that does not make sense in English, that means I've translated it incorrectly. That means I did something wrong. And it's either the fact that I don't understand the sentence and I therefore need to look at it more closely, or it means that I made a typo in my English sentence and I need to go correct it.
Because people write, whether it's ancient Greek or Japanese, whether it's a Platonic philosophical text or a game, people write intending to be understood.
Yes. I mean, there are some texts that are intended not to be understood. And one of the best parts about language is that you can take one language and render the idea into another language in a way that makes grammatical sense. Why don't we talk now the distinction between ad literam and ad sensum? There are three ways to do translation. There's ad literam, ad sensum, and a literary translation. We need to talk about that as well. Ad literam means you literally translate each word into the equivalent in the original language, whereas ad sensum means that you take what that concept means and you render it into English. So, for example, in German, if you want to say I'm hungry, you don't say ich bin hungrig. You say ich habe Hunger. I have hunger. If you're doing a literal translation, then you translate that as I have hunger. If you're doing a literary translation, an ad sensum translation, you recognize that ich habe Hunger means I am hungry, and you render that.
So what would the third one be then?
The literary translation is more amorphous and requires more context, but we have cases in which
we don't. English does not have a nominative, accusative, dative case, Colin.
Yes, you're right. We have remnants of our case system in our pronouns. Other than that, we're very basic. But what I'm saying is that when it comes to translations, we do have examples of editors or translators that take the source text, but then produce it anew themselves in a way that is more of their own creation based off of the original text versus actually just being a translation of the original text. Russian literature in the early 1900s, English translations of those almost entirely fall into this category where it's a radically different experience from what I understand reading the original and reading the English. But even recently, Emily Wilson came out with this translation of the Odyssey, which has been touted as the first translation of the Odyssey in English written by a woman. And from what I understand, and I've read a little bit of it, it's a very clear English text. It's a very beautifully rendered poem, and it does tell the story of the Odyssey. It's clearly based off of the Odyssey. But as soon as you get into the weeds, she makes a lot of certain interpretive choices that gives you a different version of the Odyssey than you would get just by reading Homer. My best friend is a Homerist and rages about this all of the time. Localization, I think, oftentimes will fall into the literary translation because you have to do things like change wordplay or insert cultural contexts, which is what these more literary translations try to do, depending on the text that's being translated. When you're translating, Kevin, what's your philosophy behind it? What do you try to do?
Well, to be honest, Colin, get through it as quickly as possible so I can move on to actually interesting stuff. That's when I can't rely on translations other people have spent much more time on themselves, the nerds. Because to be honest, I find reading stuff in the original Greek and Latin to be incomprehensibly boring.
I feel that way about Greek. With Latin, there are texts that I deal with that are not translated. I have to read them in the original, and like churchy texts. Luckily, churchy texts are pretty simple to read.
I once read a 500, 600 page German book, 2 volumes of that, so 1,000, 1,200 pages in Google Translate.
Yeah, I was just about to say, one of the best things that has happened for graduate students, though one of the worst things for our language comprehension, is the fact that you can just take a picture of a page and let Google do all the work for you. It has increased my French reading by a lot. But what I'm trying to get at is your translation philosophy. So my translation philosophy is I like the ad sensum translation, this middle ground. I would call ad sensum a form of a literal translation, just with it's one step removed, where you're still trying to render faithfully the original text, not taking into account cultural contexts or how we understand things in the modern world, because I'm trying to understand the text. I'm trying to understand the text, the time period the text is from. But I do recognize that there are certain things that you just have to render in an English way to make it comprehensible. For example, the word for Thursday in Latin is something like the third festival day, Tribus Feria, or something like that. And you should just translate that as Thursday, because that's what it's actually referring to. You don't need to break that down.
You should localize that as Thursday.
Fuck you. It's not
You know, I
localization.
get to a larger point. I am in favor of essentially localizations over translations. Take games, for example. The object of the game is to play it and to have fun. And Trails would not be as fun if it was even a literary translation, much less a literal one. That's the front I think of most for translation versus localization these days.
When it comes to my games, I think philosophically speaking, I prefer knowing that the game is as literal as possible while still being comprehensible in English, which is what all good translations should strive to be anyway. But I don't know Japanese, so it's not like when I'm playing a game that I'm looking up the original script and comparing it and seeing how faithful it is. So the example that you brought up about Three Houses, where the literal translation had been data mined, and then you can see the changes they're making afterwards, that's an incredibly rare case. And it's something that we deal with our ancient texts a lot, because things like Loeb editions have the original on one side and the English on the other. But that's not the same thing with games. With games, if I'm playing it and everything makes sense and it gives me a cohesive experience on its own, my suspicion is not going to be raised that things are being unfaithful to me. Now, sometimes that immersion breaks. So, for instance, in Cold Steel 4, some characters are talking about things that happened in the past, and they're trying to talk about the events that happened in Bose or Bose, how you pronounce that, back in FC. But I don't know what the hell NIS America were thinking, because they spelt it like Baus, like Bauis. Like, it does not look like Bose at all. And it's only by having the context of the previous games that I figured out that's what they were talking about. And to me, that is like an egregious error that should have been caught.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder why it wasn't. Because I assume these studios have quick reference documents for proper nouns and places, so they have the exact same rendering into English for all of the occurrences.
The only thing that I can think of is that NIS America started with Cold Steel 3, whereas XSEED took all the games before that. So maybe they didn't have enough experience. It's not like Bose has come up until that point in the Cold Steel games, but still, it's not that difficult. I would imagine as translators for these games that you have played all the ones beforehand, because it provides context you need to translate it.
I wonder if how much NISA of America can go to the XSEED localizations for that kind of thing. Can they use? What can they use? What can they not use?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that has to be wrapped up in so much legal red tape. There has to be a certain amount of consistency, names, places, terminology, for instance, like ordnance, right? They have to keep the same stuff there to be consistent. They can't just change, it can't be quartz in 7 of the games and sapphires in the other games, right? That's just not going to work.
Yes.
So there has to be some kind of coordination there. It's not like we ever see scenes flashed back to those games like word for word. Actually, yeah, you do. With the original 2 Cold Steel games, you get flashbacks to those. There has to be some kind of agreement where they can quote, I think. To our audience, how do you judge a game's translation, if you care about these things at all? Because this is an issue that a lot of people have very strong feelings about. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it. So I want to know what our audience thinks about it.
Yeah, and I want to know, how are you all feeling about the Zerofield news in the past week? What will you be doing about it? What's your thoughts? What's your considerations? What are some games you think have really good or really bad localizations, and why? Send us an email, at us on Twitter. We want to hear your thoughts on the matter. Okay? So I'm Kevin. That's Colin. Tune in next week as we get into Trails SC Chapter 1.
Thanks for listening, guys. Bye bye.